So I'm convinced that everybody in Old Testament and New Testament studies, and probably Islamic studies, but I don't know enough about that, should be forced to take a class on early Mormonism and study it, because there are things that we can learn from early Mormonism that we can that we can apply to these other fields. And I'll give you an example, and I want your thoughts on it. So there's a big, not even a debate, there's a big discussion about Paul and in the New Testament, which letters he wrote. Yeah. And they'll say, well, Paul wrote this letter, but that letter is either a forgery or it was written by one of his disciples, depending on your perspective. And the reason is he uses the same terminology as Paul, but in a completely different way. And so that's not Paul's terminology. That's, his student heard that term, but he's using it in a different way. And I look at early Mormonism, and look, I'm not a Mormon. I don't believe in Mormonism. So from my perspective, I accept the critical approach that says Joseph Smith just pretty much made it all up. And if Joseph Smith made it all up, and he's saying about the first vision, it was the Lord, and then it's the Father and the Son, and those are very different things. I think they are. And then in the Book of Mormon, he's anti-Masonic, but later he joins the Masons. I mean, this is textbook stuff that you would say, well, no, that was written by Joseph Smith. If you were coming from New Testament studies or Old Testament studies, Joseph Smith wrote that, but Oliver Cowdery must have written that, or some other guy, right? Who knows? Because they have different approaches to Freemasonry, or they have different approaches to, what the first vision was. Or a great example is something I wrote to you in messages before this interview, which to me is an incredible example, is this idea of what happens when you die, right? So in the Book of Mormon, there's eternal damnation, eternal punishment. And then in the Doctrine and Covenants, he tell us about that one, because that's incredible. That's you would have to say in medieval studies or Old Testament, New Testament studies that there's two different authors, but we know there's not two different authors, or at least we think so, right? So tell us about that, about the eternal damnation and how that, or punishment, in the Book of Mormon versus in the Doctrine and Covenants or Book of Commandments.
Right. Well, Joseph Smith, he had to deal with what a lot of early charismatic groups end up having to deal with, is non-fulfillment of prophecy. Recovering from mistakes, trying to change or spin certain things. I liken it to just about like if you study psychics, psychics who foretell the future, who read people's fortunes and things. They're not always right, and they don't always expect themselves to be right either. But neither did Joseph Smith. And plus, you start right away with the failure of certain things. He would give out what God's decrees are unalterable. That would be one of the statements. And then he would give a decree, and this decree said so-and-so will go with so-and-so on a mission, and it would give a list of, and in the beginning, his revelations had to do with minute, details of everyday life almost, administrative things. Every little administrative decision is a revelation, because that's what they bragged about, being different than everybody else. We have revelation and they don't. That's why they don't have authority. They don't have revelation. Well, so when he signed so-and-so to go with so-and-so on a mission, and then that person apostatized before the mission, well, didn't God know that? So he would try to get out of those things by saying that God can alter, what he says. Joseph Smith himself would say, well, God would say, do this, but then certain things would change, and then God would change, what he would do. So he would try to spin it that way. And a lot of his early followers noticed that and quit. you know, like
So this is not unique in the history of religion. So,
no,
in Islam, famously, Muhammad, the original revelation was that they should pray in the direction of Jerusalem. And then at some point, Allah changed his mind. And here I want to be careful because I'm not an expert in early Islam. But basically, there was a new revelation that says, no, the Qibla is now towards Mecca. And they have no, and this actually is a major focus of early Islamic jurisprudence and study, is what are the earlier parts of the Quran, because it's not in chronological order, and what are the latest parts, because they have what's called the doctrine of abrogation. Allah absolutely gives new revelations, and only the latest revelation is what's binding today. So if in one verse he says, cut the throats of the unbelievers or something, and I'm sure I'm misquoting that, I apologize. And another one he says, there's no compulsion in matters of religion. It's fundamental which is later and which is earlier, because that determines what you do in the 21st century. And there are huge debates about this in Islam, if I understand correctly. So you're saying there's a similar thing in Joseph Smith's career, where his revelations God would change his mind, basically, and maybe in your terminology, would you say that? How would he describe it?
Okay, so he had different ways of getting out of these problems, and or recovering from failure.
Mm-hmm.
So another example would be the main revelation or reason for Joseph Smith. His mission was to establish a New Jerusalem in America, a Zion in Independence, Jackson County, Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
And that never happened.
Well, originally it wasn't even in Missouri. Wasn't it across the Mississippi River in Indian Territory? Am I wrong about that?
Originally, it was in Indian Territory, but as the missionaries went there to find a spot, they were kicked out of the Indian Territory. And so Joseph Smith had to even come to Missouri to find the place. I mean, why didn't he just look in his stone or whatever and find it when he over there in Ohio? No, Joseph Smith had to come all the way to Missouri and look around, and then he gets a revelation, it's by the courthouse in Independence, Missouri, and that's where it was established within the territory, United States territory at the time. And it was supposed to be among the Lamanites, and
which are what we would call the Native Americans, or in my generation they called them the American Indians. Yeah.
The American Indians, now Native Americans, they were in the Book of Mormon Lamanites. There were Nephites and Lamanites, and the Lamanites destroyed the Nephites, and then the Lamanites became the Native Americans. So, and they believed the early Mormons, just part of Joseph Smith's mission was to convert the Native Americans who were Israelites and fulfill Old Testament prophecy by converting, and New Testament, converting them to Jesus and causing them to repent and learning their true heritage. And that was all part of the latter days. The signs of the latter days was the restoration of Israel, which this was his version of it. And so that didn't happen. They got kicked out of Missouri. They got persecuted and kicked out of Missouri, and they were never able to fulfill that revelation. And it caused a lot of anxiety about unfulfilled revelation. So how do you handle that? And what Joseph Smith gets another revelation when he's in Illinois. It says it was a commandment to build the temple in this New Jerusalem, but you were hindered. But when you go to do everything you can to fulfill God's commandments, and you can't, God accepts the offering. And so it was kind of revoked. The commandment to build the temple in this generation was revoked because they had been obedient in trying to do it, but were hindered from doing it. So God more or less excused them from the commandment. It's still a prophecy. The prophecy is still in effect, but the commandment to build it in this generation has been suspended. So
was there something where they said, well, no, he says he's saying accept the offering. So he's not saying, well, you didn't get to do this because you were sinners, which would be like an Old Testament sort of explanation. Um, you're saying it's because, okay, some outside force hindered them, and so you did the best you could, basically, is
yeah,
okay.
that was part of it. But at the time when you get really down into the weeds of it all, you'll find out that Joseph Smith at first had no explanation for why they couldn't establish Zion and how they got kicked out of the Holy Land. So early Mormons, they lost their Holy Land similar to the Israelites losing their Holy Land. And how do you explain this loss? God said David's supposed to sit on the throne forever and ever, and that didn't happen. How do you explain that? And so they have their own crisis that they worked out with prophets. But then you have just as the early Mormons did the same thing, but in a lot compressed amount of time.